Now that we've discussed the subcellular mechanisms that cause muscles to contract, let's talk about how muscles actually contract in the way that you experience them in your day-to-day life. So the whole muscle contraction, when we actually use our muscles to move around and lift things and do all of that great stuff with our body. So contraction, when the myofilaments slide past each other, is going to produce what's called muscle tension, the force exerted on a load or object to be moved. Contraction may or may not actually lead to the muscle itself shortening. If the muscle tension exceeds the force of the load or object to be moved, then the muscle actually shortens, and we call that isotonic contraction. This is also called concentric contraction. So in this case, our muscle actually shortens, and we actually move our load. In isometric contraction, the muscle tension doesn't exceed the load. So for example, if you're trying to lift something that's too heavy to lift, or you're pushing against something that's immovable, like a wall, that leads to isometric contraction. So there's no actual shortening of the muscle. We still are getting those sliding filaments generating muscle tension, but the muscle itself isn't able to overcome the force exerted by the load, and it doesn't actually shorten. The force and duration of that contraction is going to vary depending on how the muscle is stimulated. And the muscle can be stimulated in order to increase that force in a couple of different ways. Either the strength of the stimulus can increase, or the frequency of the stimulus can increase. That stimulus of the muscles is going to come from that somatic motor nerve. And these motor nerves are going to actually be made up of the axons of hundreds of motor neurons. The bodies of those motor neurons are actually going to reside inside of the spinal cord. The axons are going to come out, and they are going to actually innervate the muscles at the neuromuscular junction. So, nerve made up of hundreds of motor neuron axons, and then those axons can actually split and innervate multiple muscle cells. We call this little unit made up of a single nerve cell and the muscle fibers that it innervates a motor unit. So this motor unit is the motor neuron plus all of the muscle fibers, and this can vary. It could just be as little as 4, or it could be several hundred muscle fibers that it innervates. So whenever a motor neuron activates, it always activates all of the muscle fibers in its motor unit. So this is because the neuron is going to work through action potentials as well, and action potentials are going to have this all or none quality. Either an action potential is formed and it activates the whole cell, or an action potential isn't formed. So when a motor neuron activates, it's going to in turn activate all of the muscle fibers that it innervates, and we call that the motor unit. And this motor unit can be small, as few as 4 muscle fibers, or it could be big. It could be several hundred muscle fibers. The smaller the number of fibers that each individual motor unit innervates, the greater the fine control you have over your muscles. For example, we have a lot of very fine control over the amount of force that we are able to apply with our fingers, for example. So we are going to have the options of a lot of motor neurons going towards our fingers, and each of those motor units, however, are going to stimulate fewer muscle fibers, so that we have a lot of control over how much force we can exert. The muscle fibers within a motor unit are actually spread throughout the whole muscle. So stimulation of a motor unit only causes a weak contraction of the entire muscle. So you're not like stimulating one part of a muscle and then another part of a muscle. You're actually stimulating all throughout the muscle, even if you're only activating one motor unit. When a muscle receives a single action potential from a motor neuron, that leads to the simplest type of contraction of a muscle fiber, what we call a muscle twitch. So the muscle fiber is going to contract quickly and then relax. And we can look at what this looks like using what's called a myogram, which is a tracing or recording of the activity. So this is time. This is going to be the amount of muscle tension generated. And when we look at this graph of a muscle twitch, we have 3 periods. What's called the latent period, the period of contraction, and the period of relaxation. The latent period is going to be the period between the time when the muscle is stimulated and when it starts to contract. During that time, we are going to have the events of excitation-contraction coupling. So that's going to be as the action potential is propagating along the sarcolemma, traveling down into the T-tubules, causing the release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, calcium binding to troponin, troponin moving tropomyosin out of the way on the actin so that the myosin can bind to the actin, and then we can start to generate contraction. Note, even though this is a measurable amount of time, it's still a really tiny amount of time. The scale on this x-axis is in milliseconds, thousandths of a second. So our latent period is only a few milliseconds. Then we're going to move into the period of contraction when we start to get that cross-bridge cycling. The filaments are going to slide past each other, tension increases, and then once the stimulus ends, calcium is going to be sucked back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Troponin moves tropomyosin back into the way of the myosin binding sites on the actin. We no longer have any cross-bridge formation, and the muscle relaxes. And over that period of time, tension declines back to 0. Note, contraction does occur faster than relaxation. A muscle twitch is not actually normally how our muscles work. We only actually see a muscle twitch in either a lab setting or if there's some sort of neuromuscular issue, but not in normal muscle work. Actual meaningful work is going to use what are called graded responses. Graded muscle responses are when you actively control the strength of your muscle contractions by changing the rate of stimulus or the strength of stimulus. So you're changing how many motor units get recruited and how strongly the muscle contracts. You are able to do this automatically. So you may have had the experience when you go to, say, grab a can of soda that you think is full, and when you lift it up, it feels really light because you were expecting it to be heavier than it is, and so you recruited more motor units than you actually needed because based off of your experience, that object, you were expecting it to be heavier. So we have these graded muscle responses where we control the amount of force that we use in order to move objects. So the force of contraction is going to depend on the number of cross bridges that are formed, which is going to depend on 4 factors. Remember, cross bridges are those connections between the myosin and the actin. So it's going to depend on the number of muscle fibers that get stimulated, what we call recruitment. This is going to depend on the number of motor units that get recruited. The more motor units that get recruited, the stronger the stimulus, the greater the force. The frequency of stimulation. The more frequently the muscle gets stimulated, the greater the force. And we'll talk about why that is, but these stimuli get added together. How stretched out is the muscle? Muscles work best when they are between 80 and 120% of their normal resting length. Just for an example, if a muscle's normal resting length is 10 centimeters, it works well if it's being stretched or compressed to 8 to 12 centimeters. But if it gets squished more than that or pulled more than that, it's not going to have as much force. If we contract it beyond 80% of its resting length, the filaments overlap too much. There's no place for the filaments to slide, and so we can't generate much more force. If it's greater than 120% of its resting length, then the filaments don't overlap enough. We're not able to form enough cross bridges, and so we're not able to generate a lot of force. Also, the size of the fibers. The bigger the muscle, the more tension it can develop. So people who tend to be stronger tend to have larger muscles. And our muscle cells can increase in size with regular exercise. So we call this hypertrophy, super growth, essentially. So when we regularly work out our muscles, they get bigger and stronger. So again, the factors that increase the force of skeletal muscle contraction, we have frequency of stimulus, what we call temporal summation. How many muscle fibers get recruited, how big those muscle fibers are, and how stretched out is the muscle. So with stimulus of contraction, if a muscle is only stimulated again after it's completely relaxed, then we're just going to see single twitches, and we don't get this building up of contraction. However, if a muscle gets repeatedly stimulated before it has a chance to completely relax, then what happens is the tension starts to build on itself. It goes up and up and up. And this is called wave or temporal summation. So summation means adding together. Temporal in this case is referring to time. The stimulation is happening more frequently. We're getting more stimulus in a smaller amount of time, and so it builds up on each other. And we get this stronger and stronger response in part because the cell hasn't had time to clear all the calcium out of the cytosol. So there's already calcium inside of the cytosol when it receives another stimulus, and so it releases more calcium, and we recruit more and more cross bridges to form, and so we get a stronger and stronger contraction. The tension increases. If we increase the stimulus even more, then we are going to get this what's called sustained quivering contraction that's referred to as unfused or incomplete tetanus. And if we increase the stimulation even more beyond that, then we get this constant amount of maximal tension, what's called fused or complete tetanus. Tetanus refers to this muscle tension, the muscle being contracted. If we have this prolonged contraction, then we can start to get what's called muscle fatigue, where the muscle will stop working. We can also increase stimulus strength, what's called recruitment rather than summation. So in this case, what we're doing, instead of increasing the frequency of stimulus, what we are doing is we're increasing the strength of the stimulus so that we're getting more and more muscle fibers. When we talk about our stimulus strength, we can have subthreshold stimulus. At subthreshold stimulus, the stimulus is not enough to recruit any muscle fibers. Once we reach threshold, Then we've started to recruit some muscle fibers, and we are getting an observable contraction. We are producing some amount of tension. If we increase the strength of the stimulus, eventually we reach maximal stimulus, where we have recruited all of the motor units, so all of the muscle fibers are contracting, and we have reached the greatest amount of tension that we can generate. Increasing the stimulus past this point doesn't increase the strength of contraction because we've already recruited all the muscle fibers. So subthreshold, no contraction. Between threshold and maximal, as we increase the strength of the stimulus, we recruit more and more motor units, get a stronger and stronger contraction, until we reach the maximal stimulus, at which point increasing the strength of the stimulus above that doesn't increase the strength of the contraction because we've already hit maximum. Recruitment works on the size principle. We tend to recruit the smallest fiber motor units first, and then we recruit larger motor units. So that makes sense. If less force will get the job done, use the smaller fibers. Only recruit the bigger, more energetically intensive fibers once you keep working on it and need to generate more and more tension. So first, the smallest muscle fibers are recruited. Then, as we increase stimulus, larger and larger muscle fibers become recruited. In actuality, motor units tend to contract asynchronously. They don't all go at the same time. That helps some fibers to rest while other fibers are working, and that helps to prevent fatigue, the state in which our muscles are no longer able to contract. Even when we're not actively doing anything, we still maintain some amount of tension in our muscles. This is called muscle tone, and this is in part going to be due to spinal reflexes. Remember, one of the things that we can do is we can measure the amount of stretch in our joints, and we have spinal reflexes that make sure that that amount of stretch adds up to the point where we are keeping ourselves upright. We're maintaining our posture. This also helps to keep our muscles firm and healthy and ready to go. Remember, if our muscles get too relaxed, too stretched out, they're not going to be able to contract very strongly. If we have a complete loss of muscle tone, that is called flaccid paralysis. So if we look at these pictures, even though this baby is being held up, you can see it's maintaining some muscle tone in its spine. It's keeping its head up. Its arms are lifted up slightly. The baby is maintaining its posture. It has muscle tone. This child is suffering from botulism. Botulism is going to be caused by a bacterium called Clostridium botulinum, which produces the botulinum toxin. And the botulinum toxin prevents the release of acetylcholine, the neurotransmitter that causes muscles to contract. So, all of the muscles remain relaxed all the time. Eventually, this includes the respiratory muscles and can lead to suffocation. In adults, botulism toxicity is usually going to happen due to improperly canned foods. Though in infants, they sometimes actually become infected with Clostridium botulinum. This can actually occur due to consumption of honey. Adult immune systems are strong enough to prevent Clostridium botulinum from growing in our bodies usually. So even though honey tends to contain the spores of Clostridium botulinum, adults don't develop a disease from it. But infants can develop an infection with Clostridium botulinum, and then it causes botulism, which is the paralysis. Side note, Botulinum toxin is both the most toxic substance known to man. 1 gram of botulinum toxin is enough to kill approximately 1 million people, and also people voluntarily inject it into their face. This is Botox. It paralyzes the facial muscles, which gets rid of wrinkles, which makes you look younger, supposedly. Note, Botox does have actually legitimate medical uses as well. It can be used as a treatment for migraines and certain types of back pain. When we look at the length-tension relationship of sarcomeres in skeletal muscles, again, we are going to have the strongest response when those sarcomeres are between 80 and 120% of its resting strength. If we are below 80%, then the Z-discs have already moved towards the M-line. We've already slid those filaments past each other. There's not a whole lot more room for sliding. If we are above 120, then what happens is we don't have a lot of overlap between the thick and thin filaments, so not many of these myosin head groups can grab onto the actin in order to actually generate that tension. So we are going to have optimal operating length between 80 and 120% of resting length.